Welcome once again. We're glad you're here. We are joined as always by Greg Engert, beer director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, which includes such places as Rustico, 2 locations in Alexandria and Ballston, also Columbia Firehouse in Old Town. What's on tap this week?
Well, so it is definitely that time of year again. And we are breaking out the pumpkin ales and the Oktoberfests, and soon even the fresh and wet hop harvest ales as well.
Does that mean you promise it's cooling down now?
Well, maybe not as much as it should, because that's the one thing I was going to touch on, is that everyone's big gripe these days, which I kind of don't understand that much, is that these seasonal beers like pumpkin ales and Oktoberfests are coming out earlier and earlier every year, which is certainly true. I mean, we're seeing some pumpkin ales as early as July now, whereas most people think that they are more suited for a crisper autumn evening or something like that. But the good thing is that they are such popular that the breweries are producing lots of them. So though you may see them earlier, that doesn't mean they're going to all be gone necessarily by early October or something like that. And the cool thing is that there's such a plethora of pumpkin ales, Oktoberfest, these wet hop harvest ales and such, that we were putting together a little collection of them to the tune of about 125, I think, at last count, to pour all in one day at our big, huge festival that we're doing for the first time this year called Snallygaster.
Do you think that's
which you knew
enough?
about, right? Huh? Yeah, I think it should be enough.
I have heard about it.
And I should actually mention that while it is a kind of fall autumn beer fest, it's going to be down right in Yards Park, 4 blocks east of National Stadium near the Navy Yard Metro. It's right in the shadow of where Blue Jacket Brewery will be located when we open next year. It's not all pumpkin ales and Oktoberfest. I mean, we're going to have lots of those. We're going to have tons of German styles, great imports, as well as just great beers that people love, like rare IPAs and sour ales and things like that. So it's going to be a giant beer fest with a lot of these great pumpkin ales, Oktoberfest, and things like that. Snallygaster, which every time I say that word, people kind of look at me funny, but we were looking for a cool name to to call the festival that wasn't just, Oktoberfest this or that. And Snallygaster, it turns out, after some historical kind of research, that Snallygaster is this supposed Loch Ness monster-like creature that came out of the Anacostia and apparently terrorized the denizens of D.C. at the end of the 19th century. So we're taking our name from that. Of course, the festival will be right off the Anacostia as well. And one of the beers we're certainly going to be serving that day is what we're serving right now, and that's the Southern Tier Pumking. Pumpkin ales are polarizing, I think, is the nice way to say it. You either truly love them or hate them. I've never really met somebody who's like, yeah, I kind of like pumpkin ales. It's like, it's, love-hate thing. I don't think, they're not number one on your list, right? I mean,
no, not necessarily, but I mean, also maybe smoke.
Smoky beers, definitely polarizing.
Beers.
Sour beers probably as well.
Yeah.
Anything with intense seasonings, intense flavors that are, you either like or not. Like, for instance, some people love cinnamon and nutmeg and clove, and other people don't. So, I mean, I think that's kind of where this comes from.
But in truth, I have not tried that many, so
that's
you got to keep an open mind.
And that's a cool thing that's happening now, too. I mean, first off, pumpkin ales, they do lay a certain claim to American brewing insofar as the first settlers and the colonials in America didn't have a lot of grain with which to brew. So it is true that they would utilize other sugar sources like corn and molasses, but also pumpkins and squash and things like that, just to ferment those sugars. So it is kind of a classic thing in American traditions. Of course, nowadays, while most of these pumpkin ales are in fact brewed with pumpkin, it's not a ton of pumpkin in there. And in fact, the flavors we associate with pumpkin ales, there's actually pumpkin spices that we would actually find in pumpkin pie. So in some ways, you always think these beers should be called pumpkin pie ales, because really, that's what we're associating the flavors with. Not so much just the flavor of pumpkin, because honestly, a lot of the pumpkin sugar gets fermented out anyway. So the cool thing now is it's not just every pumpkin ale that comes out is 5 or 6% alcohol, mildly sweet up front, semi-dry finish, spicy. You have a lot of people utilizing these pumpkins and the idea of pumpkin ales in different ways. You're seeing those that are kind of hoppy. You're seeing porters and stouts brewed with pumpkin and spices. So it's getting a little bit more innovative. The field's getting a little bit more diverse. And then, of course, you have one of my absolute favorite pumpkin ales ever. I look forward to it every year, and that's Pumking from Southern Tier Brewing Company. And I will say that this beer is the pumpkin ale that even those that say they don't really love pumpkin ales tend to actually enjoy. So,
all right. I mean, the color is phenomenal.
It smells so good. Yeah.
So if being visually appealing is important,
it is really cool.
This fits the bill.
Glowing,
for sure.
kind of copper, orangey, almost pumpkin color to it.
It isn't. The nose is amazing.
So, I should maybe I should have mentioned this before. This is a very strong pumpkin ale comparatively. It's about 8.6% alcohol, so it's got an intensity of alcohol there. Southern Tier typically lists all of their ingredients on their bottles. They don't talk about the specialized ingredients here. It's kind of, they're a little bit evasive on the topic. I think they have their own secret blend of spices here, and maybe more. I mean, I get so much more to this beer than just say a big hit of cinnamon or maybe ginger or clove or nutmeg. And what I think that is from is the malt base that this has and the pumpkin. I mean, you get a really great bready quality. It's almost like the crust, the doughy crust of a pumpkin pie. It seems to me like there's vanilla in here. At least I'm smelling that in the aroma. It comes through. It almost has like a whiff of like sugar cookies too, which I love. So there's more to it than just pumpkin spice.
And I love pumpkin pie. And
Me too.
I'm not saying it tastes like pumpkin pie, but you could almost cinnamon roll comes to
cinnamon
mind
roll,
too,
and
which is the cinnamon you mentioned,
yeah.
the bready quality.
But more, and like a frosting quality to it, almost like whipped cream. This one just seems to me, when I return to the glass, it does evolve and it's got lots. Now, it's definitely all the flavors, the nuances are coming out are definitely dessert. I mean, you're thinking pumpkin pie, but then you're thinking sugar cookies, cinnamon rolls, almost a kind of candied quality and caramelization going on here as well. But there's just an array of flavors, and I love it. I think it's great.
Before we talk about what you would pair this with, maybe a little history, and we've talked a lot about the history of beer, on which you are an expert. And you talked just a moment ago about the squash, the various things that people use and have used for a long time to make beer. How did they come up with this idea? Were they sitting on a log looking out at the water from the beach and say, well, there's a patch over there, why don't we give those a shot?
I think, it's a great question, specifically because, beer has been being brewed since the beginning of what we call civilization proper. 8 to 10,000 years ago, civilization began in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around grain growing, harvesting, and storing communities. And so naturally, they were fermenting that grain as well. I think along the way, true science as we know it is something that came along about 150 years ago. So there's a lot of empiricism over time. This is a trial and error. If we do this, this, and this, it tastes fantastic, and we make this beer that gets us intoxicated, which is probably necessary to life back then, I can imagine. But if we do that, and that, we might make something that tastes awful or does nothing. So I think it's a lot of trial and error. And probably, to hypothesize, over time, they would associate sweetness with sugar and with fermentation. And so they knew that they could ferment grain after malting it. They knew they could ferment all sorts of fruits. Why not try anything that kind of grows from the ground and has the similar properties? So pumpkin with its starchy sweet flesh or squash or something like that. So probably just a good trial and error.
It makes you wonder about the list of things that were tried and discarded immediately.
Absolutely.
Could we make it with poison ivy?
Yeah,
could
right.
We make it with tree bark.
That actually is something. Spices. Hops are the main spice that we use today, but that really took over in the 14th and 15th centuries. Before then, hops were utilized somewhat, but hardly at all. Back then, what they were using were wild herbs and spices that loosely are called gruit, which is Old German for wild herb. And this would be weird things like bog myrtle and yarrow and mugwort, but you got to think to yourself, how do they decide to use those? Well, probably by deciding not to use others. And we think that some of the restrictions on what you could brew with in the old days, Middle Ages primarily, in the feudal times, had to do with saying do not only brew with these things, because if you start just brewing with anything that kind of grows, we could have some serious poison issues on our hand.
And we talked a few weeks ago about the German purity law, and as you mentioned, well, just think, if we always followed that, we wouldn't have these great beers
Innovations,
that we have
exactly.
today.
And back then, those purity laws were in some ways enacted to keep the people safe and in health, so, restricting, so you don't brew something awful or something like that. But primarily, they were enacted to make sure that better beer was brewed. Because the lords that make these decrees have a lot to gain by taxing the beer that's brewed, by brewing it themselves and selling it. But if it doesn't taste great, they're going to have nothing to tax. So they were doing, restricting when and with what you could brew in order to make sure that better beer was being made, and they could make more money off of it.
So what would you pair this with other than a big turkey leg and mashed potatoes?
Well,
I think it would be great with those.
It's an interesting thing. It depends on what you like, how much spice you like, because you can make a lot of things kind of. You can make savory things kind of sweet. You can make dessert. You can make them kind of desserty, so to speak. And so if you like that kind of thing, I was thinking like homemade stuffing, because with all the herbs and spices and doughy, rich kind of bready qualities would be great with this. Now that said, some people would be like, I don't want these kind of desserty spices in my savory. But you're right. I mean, Thanksgiving, pack a couple bottles away for Thanksgiving because it'll go great all the way. Start with it to loosen up at 8.6%. We go into your turkey, your stuffing. Applesauce would be awesome with this. Mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, I think even better because of the kind of the sweetness that we have in the beer. But then make sure you have some around for dessert. Now that said, we've kind of evolved past the idea of similar on similar all the time. So I'm not going to suggest necessarily that you bring this out to pair with pumpkin pie. It's almost, if it's that obvious, then we must be missing something. I would say instead to look for other desserts that could work well with this. So I even just sweet chocolate desserts, and this would be really cool. Mousse, exactly. Yeah. Mousse would be awesome. Any breadier desserts, other kinds of pies, apple pie. This would be bringing cinnamon to the apple pie, things like that, and it's wonderful. And then of course, wonderful on its own. It's kind of like pumpkin pie in a glass.
Have plenty on hand when the in-laws start talking about politics.
Yes, exactly.
Have you got a question for Greg? Next time I'm going to ask a question somewhat along these lines from a big fan of Beer of the Week. What's the strangest thing maybe that beer has been made with? It's the list is endless, so we'll maybe tackle that next time. If you have a question for Greg, here is the email. Send it to us, beeroftheweek@WTOP.com. Greg, thank you as always.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Please, everyone, always do drink responsibly, and be sure to bring your thirst next time for another Beer of the Week.